Okay, so the first of our four topics for the final lecture on economic sustainability is inequality and poverty. Okay, so there were our key problems. We put them all together on one slide now. And we're focusing on the first one, inequality and poverty. Ah, right. We're slightly out of picture here. I need to tweak things here. Sorry, let me. Okay, I didn't think about that when I was doing these slides. Never mind. Um, there we are. Let me see. Inequality and poverty. And here is our sort of conceptual framework to get our heads around these questions. So this is going to be in the background most of the time. Okay, so how do we describe inequality in wealth in terms of the picture? Okay, that's the first question. So wealth, that's like your förmögenhet, that's how much do you own? Well, basically in the picture, everything people own is a form of capital. So the total wealth in the economy is the total stock of capital. Okay. So you might think, well, what about money? Well, money, ultimately, when you have money, ultimately you own capital, either directly or indirectly. Okay. And the capital stock, that's all the houses in the economy, all the roads, all the factories, all what Marx might have called the means of production in the economy. Okay. But plus, well, yeah, not just the means of production, because it's also things like houses. Okay. So that's wealth. So wealth inequality then is differences in the amount of the means of production or the total capital stock that people own. Okay. What about income inequality? That's quite different. Okay. There are two parts to income inequality, or income itself comes from two different things. One is payments for your labor services. So here people are trotting off to the labor market and then they end up working in one of these three sectors, right? According to this framework. But there's one other way they can earn income, right? Or gain income. And that is on the interest on their wealth, right? Their capital stock. If they're renting, if they own productive capital, then they get interest on that. They get rental payments effectively from firms. So if you own shares, you get dividends. If you have money in the bank, then the bank owns the shares through your money, but then you get interest. If you own a house, you get a flow of benefits from the house. So there's two types of income. One is your wage income and the other is your returns on your capital stocks. Okay. So large wealth inequality leads automatically to significant income inequality, but differences in wages add to that. Okay. Or if wages are very even in an economy, then that may even diminish the underlying inequality from wealth. Okay, so that's just a bit of background on inequality. In what ways can environmental policies, or the lack of them, worsen inequality? Okay, and there's basically two categories that I'm thinking of here. One is regressive taxes. So, for instance, climate taxes, like a tax on fuel for cars, that may actually, as a proportion of the income, that may hit people harder who are on lower incomes than people who are on higher incomes. Because people on lower incomes may spend a bigger proportion of their income on fuel than people on higher incomes. And when we look at the data, if you look at figure 3D in the Sager paper, by 3D, that's the bottom right-hand corner, you will see that people with low total expenditure spend a slightly bigger proportion of that on, I think it's fossil fuels basically in that figure, or if it's energy, I can't quite remember now. So basically, carbon taxes tend to be slightly regressive, that the people with low expenditure, low incomes, it costs them a slightly higher proportion of that income, carbon taxes. So that's obviously a problem, and is one of the reasons why you see these protests and so on against high fuel taxes, for instance. But it's definitely not the only reason, and we'll come back to that. But the lack of environmental policies also can worsen inequality, right? If we think of who is suffering most from climate change, for instance, it is people in the hottest countries in the world, very broadly, not precisely, but broadly, and those countries are, again, very broadly, the countries with currently the lowest incomes. And you can see that in the paper by Toll that we referred to earlier, and I think there's a link to it here, but we'll come to that shortly. Okay, so damages hit, for instance, sub-Saharan Africa hardest. Okay, so have a look at the Toll paper for that, but we'll come back to that very, very shortly. So assuming you're in sub-Saharan Africa and you're hit by climate damages, what do you do? Okay. And according to Cruz and Rossi Hansberg, and according to what we see in the global economy, one thing you can do is migrate. Okay. You migrate to other countries where you have better opportunities to make a sustainable livelihood, to have a decent income and a decent life. Okay, and of course this migration is happening anyway, but of course it's made worse or increased, exacerbated by climate change. And interestingly, what Cruz and Rossi Hansberg show is that migration, all else equal, migration benefits countries to which people migrate. Okay, because people are the great asset, right? The more people in your country, economically, the better. Okay, you've got a more dynamic economy, more people to have new ideas, more competition, which drives technological progress, etc. Okay, we call that I'm sure that Cruz and Rossi Hansberg would use this term, call it agglomeration benefits, the benefits of moving people together. So all else equal, people leaving these sub-Saharan African countries is bad for those countries. It's bad for their long-run economic development. But it does mean that there's more land to go around. So in the short run, when they're dependent on food production to survive, it's obviously good for them. But in the long run, a better strategy, the ideal strategy to get out of poverty and respond to climate damages, is to make yourself much less dependent on the returns from the land where you live in the short run, which means you develop better technologies, become more productive, can join the global market, right, and make stuff, not necessarily just food, that other people want, join the global market and massively reduce your vulnerability. Okay, that must be the economic take on it anyway. Okay, So, in what ways can environmental policies, or lack of them, worsen inequality? They can be regressive locally. They can hit the poorer people somewhat harder, a bit harder than the richer people, proportionally. But lack of policy is globally hitting the poorest people way harder. So what should we do about it? Well, imagine a global fund in which polluters paid in accordance to their emissions, or according to their emissions, payments into the fund, but payments out of the fund were in accordance with damages. So if a global price of carbon was administered globally, or administered globally, then you could take in those tax payments, the revenues from those, and then redistribute them to the countries that were affected by climate change. And that would obviously be good for both, good for like justice, economic justice, and it would be economically efficient because everyone would be paying the same price for their emissions. So you would pick the low-hanging fruit globally, right? So you would immediately rapidly scale back, as rapidly as you could. For instance, you would scale back coal burning for electricity production, or for anything pretty much, not just in countries like Sweden and gradually Germany, but also in China, India, South Africa, because they would all be paying the same price. But at the same time, the revenues from the climate emissions, the carbon emissions that were happening, would be fed back to the countries, such as in sub-Saharan Africa, which is suffering the most from those emissions. Would it be politically feasible? Well, that's the big problem, isn't it? I'd like to find a reference on that. Maybe I'll try and find one. But yeah, no reference right now for that. But also relevant to inequality, economic estimates of damages are higher in percent of GDP in poorer countries, such as sub-Saharan Africa. So if we think, okay, imagine there's 2 degrees of warming, how big a percent of GDP will the UK or Sweden lose? Very little. Okay, certainly for Sweden, because we're in the set of countries where it's pretty damn cold a lot of the time. It's really not affecting us that badly. Okay, if we rule out, unless we think there's going to be some global catastrophe which will then affect the whole globe. Okay. It's affecting countries like sub-Saharan African countries much, much worse, okay, in percent of GDP, both because of the geographical position and because of their dependence on, for instance, agriculture. But according to the economic ways of estimating damages, the damages in poorer countries, such as sub-Saharan Africa, are lower in absolute terms. And now you have the toll link. Why is that? Is this defensible? Aren't people like dying in sub-Saharan Africa? Nobody's, or scarcely anyone's dying from climate change in Sweden, and scarcely anyone will die from climate change in Sweden. But in sub-Saharan Africa, they're dying. So how come damages are lower in absolute terms there? Well, it's basically, that's the economic methodology, that people have way lower incomes there. So if climate change knocks off 10% of your income in sub-Saharan Africa, well, that's 10% of $3 a day, say. That's not a lot. If it knocks 1% off your income in Sweden, well, that's 1% of whatever. What's a typical Swedish income in a day? $100 or something. Um, 300 times 130, yeah, 100, 150, $200. 1% of $100 a day is more than 10% of $3 a day, right? So even if the relative effect, so the sort of percentage knockback is much smaller in countries like Sweden, the measurement of the total economic damages is bigger. So that's like super weird in a way. And you could certainly argue against that, and it would certainly be a problem if you thought about this global fund. Because if we use that methodology to measure damages, then a lot of these payments would be going to countries like Sweden and not countries in sub-Saharan Africa. But that brings us back, like, okay, so if like somehow climate damages are smaller in sub-Saharan Africa in absolute terms, that's because people are so poor. But then we say, but that poverty is a problem in itself. Well, then that raises the question, and Toll has written about this in other places. If that's our major concern, is climate policy necessarily the best way to help those people? So is like spending a huge amount of money, imagine I've got a bad conscience about my emissions. I'm gonna get rid of my diesel car, which is more or less worthless because it's 12 years old, but I'm fairly happy with it otherwise. But I'm going to get rid of it. I'm going to buy a new Tesla for 700,000 crowns or whatever a Tesla costs. And then I'm going to save a certain amount of carbon emissions to help people in sub-Saharan Africa. Maybe it'd be better if I kept driving the old diesel and sent the money instead to sub-Saharan Africa. Okay. But again, now, I think I talked about whataboutery before. You're risking major risk of whataboutery here, right? Because do you actually send that money then to sub-Saharan Africa? Or do you just say, I won't buy the Tesla because it would make more sense? It would make more sense to send the money, but then you don't do it. Okay. But yeah, it's still a valid point that if we're really concerned about poverty in places like sub-Saharan Africa, we should be doing climate policy, tough climate policy, but we should also be doing a lot more other things. Okay. So I would put it that way, rather than saying, therefore, we shouldn't do the climate stuff. I would say we should do more. We should do both. Okay. Now, a little bit, let me see, I'll just check. Okay, this video has been going on a long time. I'm going to stop it and then do a little bit on the long run.